Welcome to my bedtime history channel. Tonight we are not in a hurry. This story is not loud, not urgent, not meant to impress. It is simply a quiet moment from the past, something small, something strange, something that once happened and then slowly disappeared. So find a comfortable position. Let the world fade a little, and as this story unfolds, you may begin to notice how easily people drift, how quietly history moves, and how familiar the past can feel, even now. Chapter 1. A Prophecy in the Dark. The bitter chill of a Roman winter dawn quietly welcomed a red-haired child into the wealthy and dangerous Julio-Claudian dynasty, carrying a heavy destiny that would one day set the greatest empire on earth ablaze. Even though he was just a frail infant who only wanted to sleep in the quiet, comforting warmth. It was the 15th day of December, long before the city of Rome ever imagined a man could play music while its temples turned to ash. Inside a deeply shadowed bedchamber, the air felt heavy with the scent of burning myrrh and damp wool. Servants moved with absolute silence across the cold mosaic floors, terrified of making the slightest sound that might disturb the exhausted mother or the demanding father. Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus was a man known throughout the city for his terrible temper and absolute cruelty. He did not pace the halls like an anxious parent awaiting good news. Instead, he sat slumped in a carved wooden chair, drinking warmed wine from a silver goblet. When the midwife finally approached him to announce the safe arrival of a healthy baby boy, he did not smile or offer a prayer. He simply stared into the dark red wine, swirling the liquid slowly around the edges of the cup. His family line was famous for two things: striking red hair and a tremendous capacity for violence. He knew his own nature perfectly well, and he knew the vicious ambition of his wife, Agrippina. They were not gentle people, and they lived in an era where gentleness was usually punished by death. When the congratulations finally came from his friends and clients, Lucius offered a response that history has never forgotten. He did not hand out coins or declare a day of celebration. Instead, he laughed, a bitter, hollow laugh that echoed against the painted plaster walls. He told the nervous crowd that any child born from himself and Agrippina could only grow up to be a complete and utter public disaster. It was a strange thing to say about a sleeping infant. Was it a moment of self-awareness or just a cruel joke born from too much morning wine? Perhaps he sincerely understood the poisonous environment of the Roman elite. The people in the room offered awkward smiles, unsure if they should laugh or pretend they had not heard the dark prophecy falling from the father's own cruel, careless lips. Meanwhile, the child lay wrapped in expensive linen swaddling clothes. His little face was flushed, and even then, a faint down of red hair was visible on his delicate head. He did not look like a monster or a tyrant. He looked exactly like every other small thing brought into a large and overwhelming world, entirely unaware of the incredible expectations already hovering quietly above his small, simple wooden crib. Outside the high walls of the villa, the daily life of the great capital continued without pausing for the new arrival. Blacksmiths hammered iron in the subura, bakers pulled hot bread from stone ovens, and politicians plotted in the marble halls of the Senate. None of them realized that the boy who would eventually force them all to sit through endless poetry recitals had just drawn his very first breath. The boy would originally be named Lucius, sharing the name of the man who predicted his absolute ruin. Agrippina looked at her son with eyes full of deep calculation rather than simple maternal affection. She was a woman who had grown up surviving exiles, murders, and the endless treachery of the imperial court. To her, This soft infant was not just a child, he was a golden ticket to power. How strange it is to think about the heavy armor of destiny being forced onto small shoulders. If you had given young Lucius a wooden toy, he probably would have played with it happily in the dust. But he was not allowed to just be a boy. He was being carefully molded into a weapon, a chess piece, designed by his mother to capture the ultimate prize of ancient Rome. Over the next few years, the dark prophecy of his father must have hovered like a ghost in the background. The father himself would not live long enough to see the joke become a horrifying reality. He died of dropsy when the boy was only 3 years old, leaving behind an estate plundered by the current emperor and a small child left entirely to the fierce machinations of his mother. Agrippina wasted no time mourning a man she barely tolerated anyway. She quickly directed all her remarkable energy toward ensuring her son would never fall behind. In the brutal race for imperial succession, she hired the best tutors, bought the finest clothing, and constantly reminded the boy of his divine bloodline. The child was taught how to walk, talk, and smile like a future ruler long before he understood why. Yet, beneath the rigid education and the golden toys, there was just a frightened little boy who was desperate for approval. He showed an early interest in art, loving the smooth touch of sculpted marble and the sweet melodies of the lyre. He wanted to paint, to sing, to ride horses around the garden, seeking the simple joys that usually belong to those who live far away from dangerous politics. But the Roman world did not need artists upon the throne. It needed generals, administrators, and stern men of iron will. Whenever the boy plucked the strings of an instrument, he felt a fleeting sense of total control and beautiful harmony. The notes obeyed him in a way that the shifting loyalties of the dangerous court never could. Music offered a quiet sanctuary from his mother's endless and relentless ambition. Have you ever noticed how often people try to escape the very things they are most expected to be? The more Agrippina pushed him toward the bloody Game of Thrones, the more he retreated into the delicate world of theatrical fantasy. He preferred the company of actors and musicians over the gruff veterans of the legions. His nature fundamentally clashed with the violent legacy of his own notorious family tree. When we look back at that dark room on the day of his birth, the father's bitter joke seems less like a curse and more like an inevitable scientific formula. If you take a sensitive, artistic child, strip away his normal childhood, fill his mind with absolute paranoia, and hand him the keys to the entire world, what else could possibly happen? A grand disaster slowly waiting to finally unfold. We blame the fire when it finally consumes the house, but we seldom think about who stacked the dry wood and struck the first flint. The boy Lucius did not choose his family, just as he did not choose to be rebranded with the name Nero later in life. He was a product of cold calculations and cruel jokes, placed onto a path from which he could never safely retreat. As the winter night finally gave way to a pale Roman morning, the infant slept soundly in his elaborate crib, blissfully unaware of the blood and fire waiting in his distant future. The prophecy had been spoken aloud into the quiet air, settling into the shadows of the room like fine dust. Sometimes the most tragic destinies are the ones we accidentally speak into existence when we think nobody cares. We all enter this massive world completely innocent and unaware, carrying nothing upon our fragile shoulders except the incredibly heavy hopes, the secret ambitions, and the very dark fears of the flawed people who happened to come before us, quietly shaping our lives long before we can even begin to speak. Chapter 2. The Taste of Poisoned Mushrooms. a carefully selected dish of plump white mushrooms, served upon a heavy golden table quietly, transferred supreme imperial power over the vast Roman world from an aging, exhausted man to a deeply distracted teenager who merely wished to spend his days playing a beautiful and delicate wooden lyre in total complete peace. Emperor Claudius was not a fool, though many people unfairly believed he was simply because he walked a slight limp and stuttered when he spoke. He had actually survived decades of bloody palace intrigue by carefully playing the role of a harmless, bumbling scholar who preferred reading ancient Etruscan history over engaging in deadly politics. However, as Claudius grew older, the tremendous weight of ruling millions of people began to make him careless in his personal life. He had made the exceptionally dangerous mistake of marrying his own ambitious niece, Agrippina, and formally adopting her young son, Lucius, elevating the boy above his own natural-born child in the delicate line of imperial succession. Agrippina was a woman who understood that patience was only useful until the perfect opportunity finally presented itself. She watched her aging husband closely, noting his worsening health and his occasional drunken regrets about overlooking his own son, Britannicus. She realized with chilling clarity that the briefly open window for her son to take the throne might suddenly shut forever. It was the 13th day of October, and a crisp autumn breeze swept through the grand stone corridors of the Palatine Hill. Inside the royal dining room, torches cast soft orange glows against frescoes painted with scenes of abundance and joy. Slaves moved silently across the ornate mosaic floors, carrying heavy trays of roasted meats, sweet figs, and exotic birds. Claudius was particularly fond of food, and he possessed a well-known weakness for boiled Caesar mushrooms. They were considered a tremendous luxury, a rare delicacy usually reserved only for the highest nobility of Rome. Agrippina knew his habits intimately, knowing exactly how fast he would reach for the silver platter the very moment it appeared before his heavy eyes. Imagine the incredible calm one must possess to sit beside a husband at a crowded banquet, smiling gently while knowing a specially prepared dish holds lethal poison. Agrippina did not flinch or sweat. She deliberately selected a particularly large, beautiful mushroom from her own untainted plate, taking a casual bite to reassure the suspicious imperial food tasters watching nearby. The kitchens had been briefly visited by a woman named Locusta, an infamous professional poisoner who cultivated deadly toxins with the devotion of a master gardener. The secret substance had been carefully painted over the most succulent fungi in the kitchen. It was an elegant masterpiece of murder, designed to look exactly like an ordinary case of terrible indigestion. Claudius eagerly consumed the poisoned meal without a single moment of hesitation. The room remained filled with the pleasant sounds of quiet laughter, clinking silverware, and soft background music plucked by Greek slaves. Nothing about the atmosphere suggested that an empire was being violently snatched away beneath the deceptive guise of a perfectly normal and cozy family evening dinner. Have you ever wondered how often the most world-shaking events happen in spaces completely lacking any grand drama? There was no lightning strike, no ominous thunder rolling across the Roman sky, and absolutely no clashing swords. There was only an old man chewing happily on his favorite snack, entirely oblivious to the deep betrayal sitting comfortably right beside him. Soon after the meal concluded, the lethal toxin began its silent and merciless work. Claudius lost his ability to speak clearly. Clutching his stomach as a deep agony suddenly swept through his aging body. He was hurriedly carried away to his private bedchamber by nervous attendants who assumed the emperor had simply partaken in far too much rich food and wine. Yet the poison seemed to work too slowly, leaving Agrippina sweating in the quiet shadows of the dimly lit hallway. A truly determined mind seldom leaves things to pure chance. So she quickly summoned the royal physician, a man whose absolute loyalty had already been carefully purchased with tremendous amounts of glittering gold found deep within the imperial vaults. The physician approached the moaning emperor under the helpful pretense of forcing him to vomit up the bad food. He carried a large, soft feather, a common Roman remedy used to clear a troubled stomach. But this particular feather had been generously dipped in a very fast-acting, deadly toxin kept ready for exactly this kind of desperate medical emergency. With one quick, seemingly helpful motion deep into the emperor's throat, the reign of Claudius was finally brought to a permanent end. Agrippina secured the doors and ordered total silence from the loyal staff. She needed time to strategically position the imperial guards and ensure her teenage son was completely ready to catch the heavy crown before anyone else noticed. Outside the heavily guarded palace walls, the overwhelming city of Rome slumbered peacefully beneath the cold, glittering stars. The cobblestone streets were empty and quiet, while millions of people slept without knowing that their supreme leader was now just a cooling corpse. The destiny of the Western world rested in the small hands of a boy who loved to paint. When the large wooden doors finally swung open the following morning, the announcement was made with carefully choreographed sorrow. The devoted wife wept public tears for her fallen husband, while the tall Praetorian guards were generously bribed with enormous sums of silver coins. They readily cheered for the awkward teenager who stood nervously blinking in the harsh, bright morning sunlight. Young Nero, now newly minted as the supreme ruler of the world, looked less like a conquering general and more like a startled deer. He had spent his morning writing gentle poetry, and now found himself surrounded by heavily armed soldiers chanting his name. The absurdity of the rapid transition must have felt like waking up inside a bizarre dream. He did not ask sharp questions about his stepfather's sudden demise, nor did he investigate the peculiar circumstances in the kitchen. It is often easier for us to accept sudden fortune without inspecting the bloody hands that actually delivered it. He simply stepped forward into the golden light of absolute power, blind to the invisible strings attached to his limbs. Agrippina walked proudly, a few paces behind him, wearing the quiet, satisfied smile of a brilliant architect, admiring her finished masterpiece. She believed she had brilliantly hacked the complex system of absolute power, assuming her soft, artistic son would willingly let her rule the world from the comfortable shadows while he remained happy playing safely inside his lavish theatrical illusion. How bitterly ironic it is that by placing a harmless artist onto a throne built for vicious monsters, she inadvertently created the greatest tragedy the city would ever know. We often believe we can carefully control the weaknesses of others, never realizing that weakness-handed supreme authority can rapidly sprout into a terror far worse than simple, cold, calculated cruelty. In the days following the elaborate state funeral, Claudius was formally elevated to the lofty status of a divine god by the Roman Senate. Nero famously quipped later in life that mushrooms were truly the food of the divine gods, since eating them had magically transformed his boring old stepfather into an immortal deity almost overnight in front of everyone. It was a dark, witty joke delivered by a young man slowly learning to mask his own deep insecurities behind a clever wall of sarcastic humor. The laughter in the marble halls rang exceptionally hollow, echoing with the silent understanding that murder had simply become another accepted method of efficient political bureaucracy within the winding corridors of the Palatine Palace. The imperial kitchen quietly discarded the few remaining leftover mushrooms into the refuse pile, scrubbing the silver platters until they gleamed spotlessly in the fading sunlight. Everything remained perfectly orderly, exceptionally clean, and deeply normal, leaving absolutely no trace of the quiet and invisible violence that had just altered the fundamental course of ancient human history, forever without a warning. Sometimes the most dangerous shifts in our vast and complex world do not arrive with the violent roar of cannons or the thunderous march of heavy armies, but hide silently within the sweet, delicate taste of an ordinary meal prepared by someone who simply claims to love us most. Chapter 3. The Golden Boy Under Glass. The first 5 golden years of a young emperor's reign appeared to be a perfect philosophical utopia, carefully guided by wise elders, until the deeply bored teenager began sneaking out into the darkest alleys of the capital, wearing heavy disguises just to feel like a truly alive and normal human being free from the suffocating golden cage. For a fleeting moment in ancient history, the ordinary Roman people sincerely believed they had finally entered a beautiful new age of lasting peace and boundless prosperity without the usual terrifying threat of unpredictable tyranny overhanging their daily lives like a dark and heavy thundercloud, constantly threatening to ruin the entire fragile republic yet again. The confused boy who now sat upon the great marble throne was barely 16 years old, making him far too young to actually understand the incredibly complex web of provincial taxes, military logistics, and endless legal disputes that kept the vast Mediterranean world functioning with a reasonable degree of efficient and orderly daily predictability. Fortunately for the highly anxious citizens of Rome, the teenager relied heavily upon 2 brilliant older advisors who essentially ran the entire vast empire from the quiet shadows while he happily plucked his wooden lyre and wrote gentle poetry about the ancient gods, leaving the heavy burden of actual statecraft to those who truly craved it. One of these powerful men was Burrus, a gruff and highly respected military commander who kept the dangerous Praetorian Guard completely loyal and perfectly content with generous financial bonuses and steady employment within the endless network of imperial palaces scattered across the beautiful sunlit hills of the tremendously wealthy Italian peninsula. The other figure was Seneca, a famous Stoic philosopher who wrote beautifully crafted essays about the incredible importance of personal restraint, quiet humility, and strict emotional control. Even though he was rapidly amassing one of the largest and most extravagant personal fortunes the ancient world had ever seen by leveraging his unique position beside the young king. Together, these 2 very different men carefully handled the vicious daily politics of the Roman Senate, lowered burdensome imperial taxes on the poorest citizens, and issued highly publicized, merciful pardons, creating a brief historical period that later writers would softly call the Golden 5 Years. Believing that wise philosophers had finally tamed the unpredictable monster of absolute monarchy. Yet beneath the beautiful, calm, and prosperous surface of this carefully managed political masterpiece, a very human and entirely predictable problem was slowly beginning to bubble because a highly energetic teenage boy simply cannot be kept inside. A perfect glass display, case forever, without eventually wanting to smash the invisible walls just to see what actually happens next. Nero quickly grew tremendously bored and deeply frustrated, sitting through endless formal Senate meetings and listening to boring old men drone on and on about boring grain shipments from distant Egypt or minor border disputes in cold Germany, when his mind was entirely focused on the exciting rhythms of Greek music and the thrill of fast chariot racing. Have you ever felt the deep and irresistible human urge to completely escape the suffocating expectations placed upon you by well-meaning older people who think they understand exactly what your future should look like, while completely ignoring the quiet passions actually burning deep inside your own restless and highly unique personal beating heart? To escape the heavy and disapproving gaze of his stuffy tutors and his increasingly demanding mother, the young ruler secretly developed a bizarre nighttime habit that completely contradicted every single noble Stoic principle the great philosopher Seneca had spent thousands of exhausting hours trying so desperately to instill within his easily distracted and highly impressionable teenage mind. When the warm sun finally set and heavy velvet darkness blanketed the winding, dirty streets of Rome, Nero would carefully strip away his expensive purple silk robes and dress himself in the rough, smelly woolen tunics typically worn by poor freedmen, smuggling himself out of the grand palace through quiet and unnoticed tiny service kitchen doors, accompanied only by a small handful of equally reckless and drunken aristocratic friends. The supreme master of the Western world would wander excitedly into the dangerous taverns and crowded brothels of the poor Subura district, seeking the raw, unfiltered thrill of ordinary human existence far away from the endless flattery of polite and fake palace courtiers. They did not go out into the city to humbly observe the poor or generously distribute secret charity like noble, disguised kings in children's fairy tales, but rather roamed the narrow, smelly alleyways like a vicious gang of privileged thugs, starting violent fistfights with unsuspecting merchants and stealing cheap goods from the late-night street vendors. It was an incredibly dangerous and foolish game for anyone to play, let alone the single most important political figure on earth. Because the streets of ancient Rome after dark were completely pitch black and heavily patrolled by desperate violent criminals who would happily stab a man simply for the minor value of his worn leather sandals. On one particularly embarrassing and painful occasion, the heavily disguised emperor made the terrible mistake of verbally insulting the beautiful wife of a wealthy senator who was also walking home in the dark, earning himself a brutal and very real physical beating that left the supreme leader covered in dark purple bruises and two deeply blackened eyes. The very next morning, Seneca and Burrus desperately tried to hide the emperor's swollen and bruised face under heavy layers of expensive Egyptian makeup, while frantically bribing terrified palace servants to remain completely silent about the fact that the living god of Rome had just been thoroughly trashed by a random angry husband in a filthy alleyway. What exactly drives a privileged person who literally owns everything in the known world to risk his own precious life just to steal a worthless loaf of bread or start a pointless brawl in a smelly tavern that most respectable citizens would cross the wide street just to avoid completely looking at during the brightest time of day? Perhaps absolute and unquestionable safety feels disturbingly similar to being buried alive when you have never actually had to fight for your own survival, leaving you feeling completely numb and hollow until you intentionally Create reckless chaos just to prove to yourself that your own red blood still pumps violently through your very own fragile human veins. This bizarre nighttime rebellion was not just a phase of harmless youthful energy, but actually the first visible dangerous crack in the elaborate illusion created by his mother and his hand-picked mentors, who foolishly assumed they could easily tame a wild and deeply insecure spirit using nothing more than beautifully written ancient Greek philosophy, books, and long lectures. While the highly optimistic Roman Senate joyfully celebrated the peaceful and bountiful early years of his calm administration, the frustrated boy inside the heavy armor of duty was quietly learning that breaking the law was far more exciting than actually enforcing it, slowly acquiring a deep and dangerous taste for complete and utter unaccountability without any serious repercussions. We often strive desperately and tirelessly to build perfect, completely safe environments for the people we deeply care about, never truly realizing that sometimes the greatest threat to a painfully manufactured peace is the simple human desire to feel the sharp, unpredictable edges of real life cutting through the soft cushions of total and absolute complete control. The brilliant tutors sincerely believed they were crafting the perfect stoic king high up in the brightest marble towers, while down in the dirty street mud, the true authentic character of the future mad tyrant was being quietly forged in complete secrecy, hidden safely behind a stolen woolen cloak and a drunken smile underneath the silent ancient Roman moon. It is a very strange and haunting truth that we often learn the most about who we truly are not by looking at the public roles we readily accept, but by carefully examining the dangerous things we freely choose to do when we confidently believe no one else in the whole world is actually watching us anymore. Chapter 4. The Shadow of the Mother. A bitter and silent Cold War slowly engulfed the glittering halls of the Roman palace as a stubborn mother refused to relinquish her hard-won power, forcing her growing son to finally realize that two ambitious rulers could never comfortably share the same narrow golden throne without inevitably destroying each other in the dangerous process. Empress Agrippina had spent her entire adult life ruthlessly, eliminating political rivals and carefully moving dangerous chess pieces across the Roman board simply to ensure her only child would wear the imperial purple crown before anyone else could claim it. She did not perform all this exhausting, bloody work just to quietly retire into the peaceful background while a clueless teenager played with the vast empire. For the first few months of his reign, Agrippina essentially ruled the known world directly through her son, acting as the true sovereign behind the beautifully painted wooden curtains of the imperial court. She personally handled state correspondence, met with important foreign dignitaries, and even allowed her own stern face to be proudly stamped onto the golden and silver coins, right alongside the profile of the young ruler. Never before, in the long and deeply patriarchal history of the great Roman Republic, had a woman asserted such incredible, visible, and unapologetic public authority over the complex machinations of the government apparatus. She was completely accustomed to giving strict orders and seeing them instantly obeyed by terrified senators and heavily armed generals who all knew exactly what she was truly capable of doing in the dark. However, power is a highly addictive and jealous mistress that rarely tolerates being handled by two different masters at the exact same time without eventually demanding a violent and decisive resolution to the awkward arrangement. As Nero slowly grew older and slightly more confident, In his own unquestionable supreme authority, the heavy invisible leash, held tightly by his domineering mother, began to chafe terribly against his fragile ego. The turning point arrived during a highly formal and extremely important diplomatic reception involving a grand delegation of visiting ambassadors from the distant and rebellious Eastern Kingdom of Armenia, who had journeyed for many months merely to seek a lasting peace treaty with Rome. The entire imperial court gathered in their finest white togas to witness this significant and highly ritualized event unfold in the grand throne room. Young Nero sat uncomfortably upon the grand elevated platform, trying desperately to look majestic and terrifying as the foreign dignitaries slowly approached him carrying beautiful gifts of gold and exotic spices. Suddenly, a deep hush fell over the crowded assembly hall as a very familiar and formidable figure swept proudly through the large bronze doors without waiting for any proper official introduction or royal permission from the guards. It was Agrippina, dressed royally, in shimmering purple silk and heavy golden jewelry, marching deliberately up the marble steps with the clear intention of sitting directly beside her son upon the elevated imperial dais to officially receive the foreign envoys exactly as an equal sovereign partner. The terrified Roman senators instantly held their collective breath, completely unsure of how to react to this massive breach of political protocol. Fortunately for the young emperor, the brilliant philosopher Seneca was standing quietly in the shadows nearby, quickly assessing the tremendous danger and utter humiliation of the rapidly unfolding awkward situation. He urgently stepped forward and softly whispered into Nero's ear, urging the confused boy to immediately stand up and walk swiftly down the wide marble steps to graciously welcome his approaching mother before she could take her seat. Under the clever disguise of offering deep filial piety and tremendous public respect, Nero successfully prevented Agrippina from actually reaching the grand imperial throne beside him, diffusing the massive diplomatic crisis without explicitly starting a shouting match in front of staring foreigners. But the subtle and silent political damage had already been permanently done within the hearts of both the furious mother and the deeply embarrassed son. That small and silent stare-down on the polished marble steps served as a stark and terrifying revelation for the growing king, who finally understood that his mother actually viewed him as nothing more than a convenient, fleshy puppet created solely to hold her glorious golden crown. He realized with deep resentment that he would never truly command fear or respect as long as she hovered constantly above him. Have you ever watched two unyielding forces slowly crash into each other, because neither side believes they should be the one to finally compromise or take a single humble step backward into the quiet shadows to simply allow the other person the necessary space to breathe and actually grow? It is a deeply tragic flaw rooted safely within the darkest corners of our stubborn and selfish human nature. Following the awkward incident with the Armenian ambassadors, Nero began quietly and systematically stripping away Agrippina's tremendous unofficial influence over the massive royal bureaucracy by carefully removing her favorite loyal allies from high political office and replacing them directly with men who answered exclusively to him. He actively stopped sharing valuable state secrets with her and deliberately ignored her forceful demands during the daily meetings of the royal advisors. Agrippina responded to this unexpected youthful rebellion, not with quiet grace or gentle understanding, but with the furious and unstoppable rage of a cornered predator believing her ultimate prize was being unjustly stolen from her by a disobedient child she had personally created and protected. She started openly berating him in front of shocked palace servants and viciously reminding him who exactly had placed him upon that massive throne. She even began to darkly suggest that perhaps her deceased husband's natural son, Britannicus, who was currently living quietly under heavy guard within the vast palace network, might actually be the true and proper legal heir to the Roman Empire after all. A terrifying, veiled threat that narrowly stopped just short of openly declaring a bloody and complete civil war right inside the winding corridors of the Palatine. The relationship between mother and son rapidly deteriorated from a smothering, overprotective embrace into a deeply paranoid and highly lethal strategic dance where both sides constantly watched each other with deep suspicion, knowing full well that the cost of losing this vicious internal power struggle usually meant an agonizing and very sudden death administered through a tainted cup of sweet wine or a quick dagger in the dark. Nero quickly learned a highly valuable and brutal political lesson that would unfortunately shape the entire remainder of his bloody reign moving forward. He slowly realized that complete absolute power is completely indivisible, making it entirely impossible to safely share the tremendous burden of command without constant fear that the other half will eventually decide they want the entire bright and heavy crown all for their very own head. Eventually, he ordered his own mother to formally relocate out of the grand main palace and into a smaller and much less prestigious villa far removed from the daily operations of the complex government bureaucracy, surrounding her with spies and heavily armed guards disguised as simple helpful garden servants who diligently reported every single move she made directly back to the trembling teenager sitting lonely upon the great throne. Thus began the coldest and most dangerous standoff in ancient Roman history between two deeply stubborn individuals who knew each other completely, intimately, and understood every single secret vulnerability the other possessed because they shared the exact same boiling blood and the exact same limitless capacity for unspeakable violence, justified by the beautiful but poisonous illusion of perfect political order maintained under supreme absolute authority over millions of lives. The grand corridors, where they had once walked proudly together, were now filled with soft whispers and suspicious glances from nervous courtiers who quietly placed their secret bets on which monstrous figure would ultimately strike the first decisive fatal blow in a feud that could never truly end with a peaceful and loving reconciliation between family members, completely blinded by unstoppable greed and a tremendous thirst for complete control. It is a strange paradox that the people who give us incredible life can sometimes become the greatest possible obstacle to us actually living it full effect on our very own independent terms, when love is replaced completely by a suffocating desire for total control that slowly strangles every honest emotion until absolutely nothing remains inside except deep paranoia and a chilling sense of true utter loneliness. Chapter 5. A boat designed to sink. A beautifully designed wooden ship gliding peacefully across the shimmering bay of Naples secretly carried a tremendously heavy ceiling, carefully rigged to violently collapse and instantly murder the unsuspecting empress, who was merely enjoying a cool summer evening breeze after finally reconciling with her deeply disturbed and highly paranoid teenage son. It was the month of March, a time when wealthy Romans fled the crowded capital to enjoy the gentle spring weather along the southern coast. Nero had generously invited his estranged mother to the coastal resort town of Baiae to celebrate a sacred festival dedicated to the great goddess Minerva. The invitation appeared to be a very sincere and loving attempt to finally mend their deeply broken royal relationship. Agrippina was naturally suspicious because she understood better than anyone else how quickly a warm smile could conceal a sharpened dagger. Yet despite her deep political instincts, she was still a mother desperately wanting to believe that her only child had finally forgiven her endless meddling. She accepted the generous invitation, arriving at the lavish dinner party, wearing her finest pearls and a quietly cautious but hopeful demeanor. During the magnificent banquet, Nero played the role of the devoted and highly affectionate son with incredible theatrical skill. He placed her in the seat of greatest honor, spoke softly to her throughout the lengthy meal, and lingered lovingly when it was finally time to say goodnight. He kissed her eyes and held her tightly against his chest, masking his dark and murderous intentions behind a perfect illusion. Rather than allowing her to return home in her ordinary vessel, the young emperor insisted she take a magnificent new pleasure barge he had commissioned specifically for her use. It was beautifully decorated with carved wood and colorful silk banners, looking like a tremendously generous gift from a loving heart. Hidden high above, her comfortable couch rested a massive canopy filled with heavy lead. The intricate mechanical trap had been carefully designed by the commander of the Roman fleet, a man who clearly possessed more ambition than actual engineering skill. The elaborate plan was simply to drop the heavy roof directly upon the Empress, while the ship sailed quietly across the dark bay, allowing the entire tragic event to look exactly like a terrible but unavoidable nautical accident in the choppy waters. The night was absolutely perfect for a quiet sail. The sky was completely clear, filled with countless glittering stars, casting a silver glow across the gentle waves. Agrippina rested comfortably upon a soft couch alongside two close friends, happily discussing the successful reconciliation with her son, while the oarsman rowed smoothly toward her coastal villa. Suddenly, a sharp whistle broke the total silence of the beautiful evening. Without warning, the heavy wooden pins holding the elaborate ceiling in place were suddenly pulled free by loyal servants hiding above. The tremendous weight of the lead canopy crashed violently downward toward the relaxing passengers. But the masterful assassination attempt rapidly turned into a truly comical and embarrassing failure, because the sturdy wooden sides of Agrippina's tall couch accidentally caught the falling roof and completely stopped it, instead of being instantly crushed beneath the terrible weight as carefully planned. The brilliant Empress merely suffered a minor scrape on her shoulder from the debris. Panic immediately erupted across the shaking wooden deck as the clumsy assassins realized their elaborate trap had completely failed to kill the primary target. The bribed sailors desperately decided to try and purposefully capsize the entire ship by leaning heavily over one side. Chaos consumed the sinking vessel as innocent sailors struggled against the bribed crew members in the pitch-black darkness. One of Agrippina's loyal friends horrifically misjudged the terrifying situation, foolishly screaming out that she was actually the Empress in a desperate bid to be rescued quickly by the men in the water. The sailors instantly swarmed her and brutally beat her to death with their heavy wooden oars. Observing this brutal murder happen right beside her in the dark water, The true Empress demonstrated the tremendous cold calculation that had kept her alive for so many dangerous decades. She realized instantly that the sinking ship was absolutely no accident at all. She remained completely silent, quietly slipping away from the terrible carnage and swimming slowly toward the distant shore despite her aching and wounded shoulder. Have you ever wondered how often our most elaborate plans simply collapse due to completely unforeseen and ridiculously small details like the awkward height of a living room couch? The complex murder scheme designed by supposedly brilliant military minds was defeated entirely by a simple piece of domestic furniture, leaving an incredibly angry and highly dangerous woman gasping for air on a wet, sandy beach beneath the stars. Upon reaching her safe villa, Agrippina immediately dispatched a polite messenger directly to her son, calmly informing him that she had miraculously survived a very tragic boating accident through the divine grace of the gods. She knew. He had ordered the hit, and he knew that she knew. But the elaborate charade of polite Roman politics required them both to pretend otherwise for just a little bit longer. Back in his own lavish palace, Nero waited anxiously in the dimly lit hallways for news of his mother's tragic death. When the wet messenger finally arrived, carrying Agrippina's extremely polite letter of survival, the young emperor was thrown into a state of absolute and uncontrollable terror. He paced the cold marble floors frantically, believing his furious mother would imminently summon the Praetorian guards to have him executed. The carefully maintained illusion of a harmless theatrical accident had completely evaporated, leaving only the grim and brutal reality of open treason. Nero desperately summoned his two most trusted advisors, Seneca and Burrus, begging them to help fix the tremendous mess he had just made. Both men stood in complete silence, horrified by the clumsy plot and unwilling to order their own soldiers to murder a royal princess. Finally, the fleet commander who had originally designed the terrible boat volunteered to finish the grisly job he had started. Anicetus gathered a small group of heavily armed men and marched swiftly through the quiet night toward Agrippina's distant villa. The time for clever theatrical tricks and falling ceilings had passed, replaced entirely by the raw, unforgiving violence that always existed beneath the thin veneer of civilized empire. When the assassins roughly smashed through her wooden bedroom doors, Agrippina did not cry or beg for mercy. She looked directly at the drawn swords surrounding her bed and fully embraced the dark destiny she had once invited into the world. Pointing boldly toward her own stomach, she famously demanded the soldiers strike her womb first, bitterly acknowledging that bearing such a monstrous son was her greatest sin. The vicious and direct murder brought a swift end to the brilliant woman who had ruled the known world from the deep shadows. But it also permanently severed the final thin thread connecting Nero to basic human morality. He was no longer just a frustrated teenage boy sneaking out to taverns. He was now a true kinslayer who could never safely wash the invisible blood from his hands. We often believe that eliminating a massive problem will instantly bring us a deep and lasting sense of incredible relief and peace. But sometimes, violently removing the greatest barrier in our lives merely destroys the crucial guardrails keeping us safely on the track, leaving us entirely free to careen wildly off a steep cliff into an endless abyss of total madness where no one can rescue us. We often try to distance ourselves from the terrible things we secretly wish to do by building elaborate mechanisms to disguise our cruelty, never realizing that the heavy weight of sudden guilt will eventually fall directly upon our own fragile heads. Chapter 6. Chasing Ghosts in the Palace. The heavy iron doors of the vast imperial palace could easily keep out armed assassins and angry mobs, but they were completely useless against the invisible terrors and phantom trumpets that rapidly began to haunt a young king quietly wandering the cold marble corridors entirely alone, in the suffocating dark, because guilt refuses to obey any earthly boundaries. When the brutal news of Agrippina's death finally reached the glittering court, Nero did not experience the sudden joyous rush of victorious freedom he had always desperately imagined he would feel upon becoming the undisputed master of the world. Instead, a deep and chilling numbness quickly spread through his heavy limbs as he realized what he had done. He believed that cutting the heavy cord binding him to his overbearing mother would finally allow him to breathe safely and freely. Yet he suddenly realized that the very same cord had always kept him anchored securely to reality. Without it, he simply began to float wildly into a terrifying empty abyss where no rules truly existed anymore. During the first few days following the dark assassination, the Roman Senate and the loyal Praetorian Guard showered the emperor with flowery congratulations, falsely praising him for uncovering a treasonous plot and bravely saving the glorious empire from the wicked and jealous grip of a highly dangerous and manipulative woman who had overstayed her powerful imperial welcome. But public flattery means absolutely nothing when your own mind secretly turns completely against you during the lonely midnight hours. As the sun quietly dipped below the 7 hills, the vibrant colors of the extravagant palace carefully melted into deep and oppressive shadows that seemed to hide countless silent, watching eyes judging his every paralyzed and fearful movement. Nero developed a terrible and stubborn insomnia that completely defied the most powerful sleeping potions, carefully brewed by the elite imperial physicians. He refused to sleep, because the moment his eyelids gently closed, he saw the pale and bloodied face of the woman who had breathed life into his very lungs, staring back at him with deep accusation. Have you ever tried to outrun a deep personal guilt by simply changing rooms, only to find that the dark sensation effortlessly follows you straight through the thickest stone walls? The entire Roman world completely belonged to him, yet he could not find a single safe corner or quiet room where he could safely rest his aching head. He began to wander the extensive network of endless hallways, wearing only a simple silk tunic, carrying a single flickering oil lamp that cast trembling orange shadows against the masterful frescoes. His bare feet slapped softly against the cold mosaics as he searched desperately for an elusive and quiet peace that had permanently evaporated from his broken mind. Servants, standing quietly in the deep alcoves, often heard their absolute ruler muttering frantically to himself in the middle of the dark night. He swore that he could distinctly hear the shrill, mournful call of ancient military trumpets, sounding faintly but persistently from the direction of his deceased mother's modest grave, echoing through the grand starlit courtyards. At other times, he claimed terrifying furies with snaky hair and burning torches were chasing him down the beautiful golden corridors, exchanging the beautiful Roman reality for a deeply tragic and classic Greek nightmare sourced directly from the very same theatrical plays he once loved to watch so innocently before he became a monster worthy of Greek vengeance. To escape the terrifying sounds ringing constantly in his ears, he desperately ordered more and more entertainments, filling the heavy silence of the palace with loud music, elaborate poetry recitals, and endless troops of clowns and dancers. He was trying to drown out a persistent ghost using a very cheerful orchestra, playing late into the sweaty summer evenings. But the psychological burden of matricide is not simply a ghost story created for amused children. It is the ultimate violation of the natural human order. Even in a brutal society built entirely upon war and constant conquest, deliberately murdering the womb that formed you was considered an absolutely unforgivable abomination that the gods would never ignore safely. This relentless inner paranoia slowly began to outwardly manifest in how the young king actually handled his everyday government duties. He looked at his closest friends, his beloved tutors, and his wealthiest senators, suddenly wondering if they too secretly wished to plunge a sharp dagger directly into his fragile back while offering him a warm and friendly smile. The wise philosopher Seneca found himself quietly shoved into the distant background as Nero slowly replaced his trusted advisors with brutal and unscrupulous thugs who feared absolutely nothing. The gentle golden age that Rome had briefly enjoyed was rapidly evaporating, replaced completely by a chilling atmosphere of constant and heavy suspicion that hung above the great city. A man who no longer trusts his own shadow cannot possibly be expected to safely trust the highly ambitious aristocrats, whispering politely in the glittering marble corridors. Treason trials slowly returned to the hushed Senate floor, with wealthy men unexpectedly forced to donate their vast fortunes to the highly nervous emperor simply to avoid facing a sudden, brutal execution. We sometimes naively believe that gaining absolute control over our external environment will magically protect us from pain, never realizing that the most dangerous and unstoppable monsters always live quietly and permanently inside the very delicate and unseen folds of our own, deeply flawed and extremely vulnerable fragile human mind where no guards can ever safely intervene. In his frantic attempts to cleanse his deeply troubled soul, Nero invited Persian magi and mystical priests to perform strange cleansing rituals over his body, desperately seeking a magical exoneration that he could not grant himself. But the dark blood always remained boldly stained across his invisible and extremely heavy conscience, refusing to be washed away by holy waters. The man who would later famously burn his own city first had to endure the searing heat of a tremendous psychological fire burning quietly without any smoke, right in the very center of his trembling heart, destroying his remaining sanity long before a single beautiful stone building actually turned to ash beneath the terrified gaze of the weeping Roman citizens. He ultimately discovered that you cannot successfully murder your mother and still maintain the comforting illusion that you are a good and noble person merely because you enjoy playing beautiful music. The tragic divide between the gentle artist he desired to be and the brutal monster he had successfully become quietly tore his fractured mind completely apart into ragged pieces. And so, the emperor of the known world continued to tremble in the dark, holding his hands over his aching ears to block out the imagined sounds of distant trumpets, slowly learning the truly horrifying lesson that the highest throne simply makes you the biggest and most visible target for your very own unstoppable and devastating personal regrets. We often discover that the most terrifying prisons we will ever inhabit do not require heavy iron bars or thick stone walls, because we build them carefully within ourselves, using nothing but the silent, unforgiving echoes of our very own irreversible and deeply tragic personal mistakes, which haunt us long after the actual deeds are fully completed. Chapter 7. The Emperor Takes the Stage. The great emperor finally stepped under the blinding lanterns of the public stage. Trembling, with fear and clutching a wooden lyre as he prepared to trade his imperial dignity for the fleeting applause of a captive audience who knew that their very lives depended entirely on their ability to cheer for a performance that many secretly considered to be a great insult to the honor of Rome. For centuries, the very concept of Roman honor was built upon a solid foundation of stoic silence, grave responsibility, and the unshakable military strength required to govern the wide-known world with an iron fist wrapped in fine white linen. To be an aristocrat was to be serious, and to be an emperor was to be almost like a remote and unmoving statue. Yet inside the heart of this particular young man, there had always lived a burning desire not to lead legions into battle, but to simply be loved by a crowd for his creative talent alone. He did not want people to bow to his crown. He wanted them to weep at the sound of his singing voice as he recited ancient myths in the dark. The occasion for this shocking transformation was the Juvenalia, a new festival Nero had created specifically to celebrate his very first shave as a young man. It was supposed to be a private celebration for the aristocracy, but everyone knew that the true purpose was to finally allow the emperor to step into the bright light of public performance without any hiding masks. Behind the heavy velvet curtains of the improvised theater, the most powerful man in the world was currently in the middle of a massive panic attack. His hands were soaked in cold sweat, making it nearly impossible for him to securely grip the delicate strings of his expensive lyre. He paced back and forth, muttering his many lines over and over again, frantically. His attendants moved quickly to apply thick layers of white lead powder to his pale face, attempting to hide the fact that their supreme leader looked like he might faint at any moment. They carefully painted his lips a deep crimson and wrapped his head in a golden laurel wreath, transforming him into a living representation of the divine god Apollo himself, standing there. Standing nearby, the philosopher Seneca and the general Burrus watched this bizarre spectacle with heavy hearts and a growing sense of deep dread. They knew that once the emperor performed like a common slave, for the public, the sacred mystery chivalry of the throne would be forever shattered. A ruler who sings for change can never truly command absolute fear or respect ever again. Have you ever felt the tremendous weight of a responsibility that simply does not fit your personal soul, forcing you to seek validation in places where you probably do not belong? Nero was not a monster in this moment. He was merely a vulnerable young man, desperately craving the sincere approval of strangers to fill the empty void left by his recently dead mother. When the signal was finally given, Nero stepped out onto the stage and was instantly met with a deafening wave of prearranged applause from 5,000 trained clappers. These men, known as the Augustiani, were specifically paid enormous sums to ensure that the emperor never encountered a single second of silence or any form of honest criticism from the large captive crowd. He bowed low to the ground, just as every common actor was required to do by ancient tradition, averting his eyes in a show of mock humility that felt deeply insulting to the respected senators sitting in the front rows. The leaders of Rome were forced to watch their divine sovereign beg for the approval of the mob like a desperate street performer. As he began to sing, his voice was small and thin, lacking the natural power required to fill the massive outdoor space. He strained to reach the high notes, his face turning a bright shade of pink beneath the heavy white makeup. Yet, Because he was the emperor, every single sour note was met with thunderous cheers and artificial tears of pure joy. Imagine the bizarre psychological tension in that space, where thousands of people were legally obligated to pretend that they were witnessing a performance of divine perfection, while their ears were actually hurting from the mediocrity. The divide between the truth and the performance was so wide that it began to swell, like a dangerous infection inside the city's fragile social body. Nero felt an incredible rush of adrenaline surging through his veins as he drank, in the carefully manufactured adoration of the throngs. For the first time in his entire life, he felt truly seen, not as a political pawn or a murderous son, but as an artist. The dangerous illusion was finally complete, and he loved every single intoxicating second of deception. He performed for hours without stopping, reciting long and complex tales of ancient Greek heroes and tragic maidens. He refused to sit down, even when his legs began to ache and his throat grew scratchy from the effort. He followed every strict rule of the theater, even wiping the sweat from his forehead with his bare hand to avoid improper behavior. The sun slowly began to set over the 7 hills of Rome, casting long shadows across the theater seats. But still the emperor refused to end his magnificent recital. The senators were not allowed to leave their seats, even to relieve themselves or seek food. The spectacle of art had suddenly become a very strange and very exhausting form of imperial torture. When the final note was finally struck, Nero remained frozen on the stage for a long moment, waiting for the final verdict of the people. The resulting roar of the crowd was so loud, it could be heard all the way across the Tiber River. He had won, not on the battlefield, but in the much more dangerous and shifting arena of fame. This moment marked the official death of the old Roman Republic's dignity. The line between reality and performance had been permanently blurred, turning the government into a grand stage, where the most important thing was no longer justice or stability, but simply the quality of the costume and the volume of the applause received from the fickle and very hungry masses. From that day forward, Nero viewed himself more as a professional performer than a practical administrator. He began to value the aesthetics of power over the ethical use of it, believing that, as long as the show continued, the empire would remain secure. He had found his true calling, and unfortunately for Rome, it required the entire world to be his audience. We often trade our most sacred duties for the cheap thrill of being noticed, never realizing that the applause of the world is often just a mask, hiding a deep and growing resentment for our lack of true character. Nero had found his voice, but in doing so, he had completely lost the only thing that actually kept a ruler safe. The theater eventually grew dark and the crowds slowly dispersed into the night, leaving behind only the empty benches and the echoes of a song that nobody dared to criticize aloud. The young king slept soundly that night, believing he was a god of music, while the wise men in the shadows quietly prepared for the inevitable coming storm. The brightest lights on any stage often cast the longest and darkest shadows, hiding the very truths we most urgently need to see until the final curtain call has already passed us by. Chapter 8: The Sweating Audience. As the emperor's artistic ambition swelled into an unstoppable obsession, the Roman theater transformed into a gilded prison where the elite were forced to endure endless hours of mediocre music while their physical endurance was tested to its absolute breaking point. Nero adopted a very strict regimen for his vocal health, behaving more like a fragile opera singer than the commander of the Roman legions. He would lie flat, on his back for several hours, each morning with a heavy lead plate resting squarely upon his chest to increase the strength of his breathing. He sincerely believed his voice was a divine gift to mankind. The young ruler also developed highly specific dietary habits to protect his throat, avoiding all cold drinks and refusing to eat certain fruits that he believed might cause unwanted phlegm or roughness. He consumed large quantities of leeks and garlic regularly, firmly convinced that these pungent vegetables were the secret to maintaining a clear, resonant, and truly melodious singing voice for his public. Soon, the occasional theatrical performance was no longer enough to satisfy his growing hunger for constant validation. He began to organize grand musical recitals that would last from the very first light of dawn until the deepest hours of the night. He expected the entire aristocracy of Rome to be present in the theater, sitting in perfectly still and respectful silence, to ensure the performance received the enthusiastic reaction he felt he truly deserved. Nero established a specialized group of 5,000 young men known as the Augustiani. These men were carefully trained in 3 distinct styles of clapping, which they called the bees, the tiles, and the bricks. Their sole purpose in life was to provide a continuous wall of rhythmic sound. These professional clappers were not there simply to applaud. They were there to intimidate the rest of the audience into displaying the same level of fervent adoration. If an ordinary citizen failed to clap hard enough, or if their face showed a single hint of boredom, the Augustiani would note their names for later questioning by the extremely violent imperial secret police. The atmosphere inside the massive stone theater quickly became suffocating, as thousands of people were packed into the steep marble benches beneath the blazing Italian sun. Because the emperor demanded absolute focus, the massive bronze doors of the venue were frequently locked from the outside, meaning no one could leave the building once the music had officially begun to play. Imagine the quiet terror of a wealthy senator who had spent his whole life commanding vast provinces, now finding himself trapped in a hot, crowded theater without any access to water or fresh air. The smell of thousands of sweating bodies mixed with the expensive perfumes wafting from the royal box, creating a heavy and deeply nauseating cloud over the entire audience. As the hours dragged on, the physical strain on the captive spectators became genuinely life-threatening for the elderly and the frail. People were forbidden from even standing up to stretch their aching legs. Some men found the experience so intolerable that they began to secretly scheme about how they might successfully escape the theater without catching the dangerous eye of the guards. The most famous human detail from these endless recitals involved respectable older senators who actually pretended to suffer fatal heart attacks or sudden fainting spells. They would collapse into the arms of their servants, who would then solemnly carry them toward the locked doors. The guards, fearing the bad luck of a corpse, would reluctantly open the gates to let them out. Other desperate people attempted to leap from the high exterior walls of the theater, risking broken bones just to escape the sound of the emperor's thin, reedy voice. There are even historical accounts of women being forced to give birth to their babies right there, in the crowded stone stands, because they were strictly forbidden from leaving their seats for any medical reason whatsoever. One particular general named Vespasian, who would one day become an emperor himself, famously committed the ultimate sin of falling fast asleep during one of Nero's longest and most boring musical numbers. He was saved from immediate execution only by the desperate intervention of his high-ranking friends, though he remained under a very heavy cloud of imperial disfavor for many years. While the audience suffered in silence, Nero remained entirely oblivious to their mounting pain and resentment. He stood upon the stage, drenched in sweat and caked in heavy white makeup, interpreting the tears on the faces of his subjects as genuine expressions of artistic emotion. He truly believed he was moving the entire Roman world to pure, spiritual greatness through his song. Have you ever noticed how absolute power can completely blind a person to the most obvious realities of the human world around them? Nero lived in a beautifully constructed bubble where everyone agreed he was a genius, while just a few feet away, the very people he ruled were quietly wishing for his sudden and very violent death just so they could go home. The relationship between the ruler and the ruled had shifted from one of political respect to a bizarre and deadly form of performance art. Rome was no longer a city of laws or military strategy. It had become a literal soundstage for one man's fragile ego. The citizens realized that their freedom had been entirely replaced by a compulsory role in a very terrible play. This endless theatrical performance created a deep and lingering psychological exhaustion that began to rot the very foundations of Roman society. People no longer believed in the truth because they were forced to lie every single time they opened their hands to clap. When a society is forced to applaud for something it secretly hates, the very concept of shared integrity begins to dissolve. The emperor continued to pluck his lyre, singing about the fall of Troy and the sorrows of ancient heroes, never realizing that he was orchestrating his very own tragedy in real time. He thought he was winning the hearts of his people, but he was actually building a deep reservoir of bitter hate that would one day overflow and consume his entire gilded world. Night would eventually fall, and the locked doors would finally be opened to release the dazed and dehydrated survivors into the cool Roman air. They would limp back to their homes in total silence, too afraid to even whisper about the ridiculous spectacle they had just witnessed. The emperor would sleep soundly, dreaming of the great ovations he imagined would last forever throughout history. We often surround ourselves with people who only tell us exactly what we want to hear, creating a beautiful illusion that eventually becomes our own personal prison, where we can no longer distinguish between sincere love and pure, unadulterated fear. Nero was the master of the world, yet he was the most isolated man within it, trapped forever by the very applause he demanded. The great theater remained standing as a silent monument to the absurdity of absolute power, its stone benches still stained with the sweat of men who had been forced to sacrifice their dignity for the sake of a song. The performance had ended for the night, but the true drama was only just beginning to simmer beneath the surface of the great and ancient city. The most dangerous silence is not the absence of sound, but the forced quiet of a crowd that has finally run out of the will to pretend that the emperor is wearing any clothes at all. Chapter 9. A warm wind in the summer. A small and unnoticed spark in a humble shop near the Circus Maximus quietly ignited a tiny flame that would eventually grow into a massive sea of fire to consume the entire eternal city. The summer of 64 AD was particularly brutal, leaving the great city of Rome drenched in a heavy, stagnant heat that seemed to press down upon the shoulders of every citizen, from the wealthiest senator to the poorest slave. The air was thick with the smell of dust, river water, and the thousands of cooking fires that flickered in the darkened, crowded slums. On the night of the 19th of July, a dry and persistent wind known as the Sirocco began to blow in from the vast southern deserts, whistling through the narrow stone alleyways and rattling the wooden shutters of the countless tiny apartments. This warm wind carried no relief. From the day's oppressive sun, only a desperate thirst and a strange sense of deep unease. Near the massive curve of the Circus Maximus, where thousands of people usually gathered to cheer for their favorite chariot teams, there was a row of small, wooden shops known as tabernae. These cramped spaces were packed with highly flammable goods like dry grain, expensive olive oils, fine textiles, and fragile woven baskets that had been drying in the sun all week. Inside one of these humble shops, a tired shopkeeper was closing up for the night, moving slowly in the dim light of a single flickering oil lamp. He was likely thinking of nothing more than seeking a few hours of rest in the quiet dark. In his exhaustion, he did not notice a small, wayward spark jumping from the wick to a nearby pile of dry straw. The initial flame was so small and quiet that it did not even distinguish itself from the ordinary shadows dancing on the painted plaster walls. If the shopkeeper had stayed for just 5 more minutes, he might have easily smothered the glow with a single damp rag or a small cup of wine, preventing one of history's greatest possible disasters before it began. But the man was already walking away into the darkness, leaving the tiny fire to grow in total solitude. Fed by the dry straw and encouraged by the steady draft of the Sirocco wind, the flame quickly found a nearby jar of oil. The moment the clay vessel cracked from the heat, the small spark suddenly transformed into a roaring and greedy little monster. Within 10 minutes, the entire wooden shop was enveloped in bright orange light, casting long and terrifying shadows against the high stone walls of the nearby great stadium. The fire did not stay within the confines of the shop for long, reaching out with long fingers of heat to touch the ornate wooden benches where millions had sat just days earlier. The Circus Maximus acted like a giant tinderbox, providing miles of seasoned wood that had been baked by the summer sun for decades. As the fire found its way into the grandstands, it created its own powerful weather system, sucking in oxygen from the surrounding streets and throwing massive embers high into the pale and starry Roman night sky. A few brave night watchmen, known as the Vigils, soon arrived on the scene, carrying small leather buckets of water and hand pumps. They were trained to fight common kitchen fires, but they had never seen anything like this growing wall of heat. Their efforts were as fruitless as trying to stop a fluting river with a handful of dry, fine sand. The fire began to leap across the narrow streets, hopping from one overhanging wooden balcony to the next with incredible and terrifying speed. The dense architecture of the city, designed to provide shade from the sun, now acted as a perfect chimney, channeling the intense heat upward and outward into the densely populated residential districts of the beautiful Suburra. People who had been sleeping peacefully in their small upper rooms were suddenly awakened by the sharp, acrid smell of burning cedar and the soft, distant roar of 1,000 hungry lions. They opened their eyes to find their bedchambers filled with thick, gray smoke that stung their throats and blinded their vision, forcing them to flee into the dark, chaotic streets. The streets quickly became a map of total confusion, filled with parents calling out for their children and elderly people, stumbling over the scattered belongings of their neighbors. There were no emergency sirens or public announcements, only the deep, rhythmic thumping of falling stone and the constant, terrifying sound of the wind whistling through the blazing high timber frames. The fire did not care about social class or political status as it marched relentlessly toward the heart of the city. It consumed the humble bakeries of the poor and the ornate temples of the gods with the exact same indifference. The great wealth of the empire, stored in beautiful marble buildings, offered absolutely no protection against the simple physics of uncontrolled combustion. As the night wore on, the sky over Rome turned a strange and sickly shade of burnt orange that could be seen by sailors many miles out at sea. To those watching from the distant hills, it looked as though the very earth itself had cracked open to reveal a glowing underground kingdom of fire that was now spilling out to swallow the human world. The heat was so intense that it began to melt the lead pipes hidden beneath the streets and shiver the expensive glass windows of the wealthy mansions on the Palatine Hill. Even the statues of ancient heroes, carved from solid white marble, began to crack and crumble into fine dust as the temperature rose to levels that no human body could possibly endure. It was a strange paradox that this great city, which had conquered every army in the known world, was now being systematically destroyed by a single element that it used every single day to cook its bread and warm its homes. The Roman Empire was at the absolute peak of its power, yet it stood completely helpless before a small careless mistake. Some citizens claimed they saw dark figures in the shadows, actively fanning the flames or preventing the vigils from doing their work. Whispers began to spread through the frightened crowds that the fire had been set on purpose to clear land for new buildings. In the midst of a catastrophe, the human mind always seeks a villain to blame for the chaos. The emperor himself was not even in the city when the fire started, having traveled to his coastal villa in Antium to enjoy the cool sea breezes and practice his music in private. A lone messenger was dispatched on a fast horse, racing through the night to deliver the terrible news that the capital of the world was currently turning into a giant pyre. By the time the first pale light of dawn touched the horizon, 3 of Rome's 14 districts had been completely erased from the map. The beautiful gardens, the bustling markets, and the ancient shrines were all gone, replaced by a smoking landscape of blackened timber and white ash that looked like the very surface of the dead cold moon. Families who had lost everything they owned sat together in the public parks, staring back at the glowing ruins of their former lives. They had no food, no clean water, and no idea where they would sleep the next night. The entire structure of their carefully ordered world had been vaporized in less than 12 hours by a single warm summer wind. The fire would continue to burn for 6 full days and 7 long nights, defying every attempt to smother it. It became a living entity with its own dark logic, swerving through the streets and jumping over fire breaks with a playful malice that seemed almost intentional. The people of Rome began to wonder if their gods had finally abandoned them entirely. It is a sobering thought to realize that every grand achievement of humanity is ultimately held together by nothing more than a few quiet moments of ordinary carefulness that we usually take for granted. The greatest civilization on earth was nearly brought to its knees because one tired man simply wanted to go to bed a few minutes earlier than usual. The sun rose over a city that was no longer recognizable, its famous skyline hidden behind a massive pillar of black smoke that stretched for miles into the sky. The fire had only just begun its work, and the true human cost of the disaster was still being calculated in the minds of those who had managed to survive. The First Terrible Night. It is a quiet reminder that the most monumental changes in our world often begin with a single moment of careless indifference hidden within the deep shadows of a very ordinary and silent night. Chapter 10. The Fiddle and the Flame. The emperor arrived back in Rome just as the Great Fire began to reach its most violent and beautiful peak, transforming the misery of millions into a grand theatrical performance that would forever burn his name into the memory of mankind. The lone messenger had reached the coastal villa at Antium, while the late afternoon sun was still casting long, golden shadows across the manicured gardens. He found Nero not in the midst of state business, but carefully testing the tension of new-gut strings on a beautifully carved lyre. The news of the fire in the Circus Maximus was delivered with a trembling voice. Nero did not immediately leap from his chair or issue urgent commands to his waiting generals. Instead, he remained perfectly still for one long, quiet minute, staring out at the shimmering blue Mediterranean Sea. His reaction was not one of terror, but of a deep and intense fascination, as if he had just been told that a great piece of theater was finally starting. He ordered his fastest chariot prepared for the journey back to the capital, but he spent an inordinate amount of time choosing the correct wardrobe. He selected a flowing palla of the deepest Tyrian purple, a color usually reserved for the most solemn religious rituals. To Nero, this was not just a crisis. It was a moment that required a very specific visual aesthetic. As the imperial chariot thundered along the Appian Way, the sky over the distant horizon began to change from a clear summer blue into a sickly, bruised shade of deep orange and sooty gray. The smell of burning history met him miles before he reached the city walls. It was a thick, heavy scent that clung to his fine silk robes and tasted of hot metal. The emperor arrived to find a city that no longer recognized itself. The grand marble structures of the Palatine Hill were already enveloped in shimmering curtains of flame, making the ancient temples look as though they were glowing from within like the fragile wicks of 1,000,000,000 expensive oil lamps. The great heart of the Roman world was beating with a pulse of pure heat. Instead of organizing the bucket brigades or visiting the wounded in the public parks, Nero retreated to the high tower of Maecenas. This lofty stone vantage point offered a sweeping and unobstructed view of the entire developing catastrophe. Below him, thousands of desperate people were screaming for help, dragging their few remaining possessions through the glowing embers in the dark. The sound of falling stone buildings created a deep, rhythmic thumping that resembled the beating of a massive and angry heart beneath the earth. Nero observed the movement of the fire with the critical eye of a master painter. He noted how the smoke curled in the night air like dark silk ribbons, and how the sparks rose up like flickering golden fireflies. He ordered his attendants to bring his best wooden lyre and a small table laden with warmed wine and sweet figs. Standing alone on the high balcony, he began to apply a thin layer of white lead makeup to his face. He wanted his features to catch the flickering orange light, ensuring he looked exactly like a tragic hero from an ancient legend. With the entire burning city serving as his massive orchestral pit, the emperor began to sing a long and elaborate poem known as the Fall of Troy. He compared the current destruction of Rome to the legendary burning of the city of Priam. His voice rose and fell, in perfect time with the crashing of the heavy imperial roofs below him. Have you ever encountered a mind so deeply detached from reality that it views the agony of others only as a complement to its own creative vision? It is a rare and terrifying form of narcissism that allows a human being to watch their own world end while correcting their own vocal pitch. Nero was not simply fiddling. He was sincerely trying to win. The small audience of terrified courtiers standing in the deep shadows of the tower watched their leader in total, horrified silence. They saw a man who had completely abandoned the duties of a sovereign to embrace the vain identity of a star. The contrast between the screams of the dying and the delicate notes of the lyre was a haunting symphony. Rumors began to scurry through the crowded streets below like hungry rats, whispering that the emperor himself had ordered the fire just to provide a better backdrop for his musical performance. While there is no hard evidence that he struck the first spark, his bizarre behavior provided all the proof the suffering people of Rome would ever need in the dark. For several hours, the supreme ruler of the Western world remained entirely lost within his own theatrical illusion. He felt a strange sense of peace as he watched the old, narrow streets of the Republic be erased by the cleansing heat. He was already imagining the new, more beautiful city he would build over the blackened bones of the old world. There is a subtle irony in the fact that Nero actually did eventually open his private gardens to shelter the homeless and purchased massive amounts of grain to feed the survivors. But these practical acts of charity were completely overshadowed by the single iconic image of him singing while the temples burned. People forgive failure, but they rarely forgive an insulting performance. The performance eventually concluded as the emperor's throat grew dry from the heavy smoke rising from the Subura district. He bowed deeply to the empty air, wiping a single bead of sweat from his brow with a silk handkerchief. He felt completely satisfied with his work, believing he had given the great fire the artistic dignity it truly deserved tonight. As he descended from the tower, the heavy smell of death and destruction finally began to seep through the fine fabric of his costume. The reality of burnt empire was waiting for him at the bottom of the stairs, but Nero continued to hum the final melody of his song. He had found the ultimate stage, and he loved it. The great fire of Rome would eventually last for nearly 9 full days, leaving 10 out of the 14 districts in total ruins. Millions of sesterces in wealth had been vaporized, and countless lives had been cut short by the indifferent heat. Yet, in the mind of the emperor, the only thing that truly mattered was that he had hit every note. This moment permanently fixed Nero's image in the tapestry of human history as the ultimate symbol of the self-indulgent tyrant. Whether or not he literally held the instrument while the flames roared, the story survives because it perfectly captures the way power can curdle the human soul into something entirely unrecognizable to the ordinary heart living below the high palace. We often want to believe that those in charge are moved by the same compassion and fear that we feel during a great crisis. But history frequently shows us that the view from the high balcony is very different from the view from the burning street. Sometimes, the people holding the reins of power are simply watching a completely different play from us. Nero eventually went to bed in a room guarded by soldiers, while thousands of his subjects slept in the open air on the hard stone pavement. He felt the creative exhaustion of a great artist, entirely unaware that the fire he had just celebrated would eventually be the very thing that guided his own violent and lonely end in later years. The embers continued to glow deep into the small hours of the night, casting a dim and ghostly light over the skeletal remains of the forum. The song was over, but the echoes of the lyre seemed to hang in the heavy ash, a haunting reminder that some melodies are far more dangerous than the flames that originally inspired them to be. We often find that the most beautiful performances are given by the people who are least capable of understanding the true weight of the reality they are so eagerly trying to represent. Chapter 11. The Golden House of Ruin. The emperor viewed the smoking ruins of Rome not as a national tragedy, but as a magnificent blank canvas for the most extravagant and impossible palace ever conceived in the ancient world. While the gray ash was still warm beneath his leather sandals, Nero began to draw ambitious lines in the sooty dirt using a polished cedar staff. He did not see the charred remains of public markets or the empty foundations of families who had lost everything in the Great Fire. To his eyes, the catastrophe was a divine gift that cleared the way. He immediately summoned two brilliant architects named Severus and Celer, men who dreamed of buildings that challenged every known law of nature and gravity. Nero commanded them to ignore every traditional limit of Roman design and budget to create a sanctuary of pure beauty. This would be known as the Domus Aurea, or the Golden House, a place built for a god. It was not just a simple house, but a vast network of gilded pavilions, artificial forests, and shimmering man-made lakes that covered over 100 acres of prime real estate. The Palatine, Esquiline, and Caelian hills were all swallowed by this new kingdom of personal excess, leaving the ordinary citizens to crowded tent cities, while the emperor designed his private paradise in the center. The most shocking feature of this new estate was a colossal bronze statue of Nero himself, standing over 120 feet tall in the entryway. He was depicted as the sun god, wearing a crown of sharp golden rays that caught the morning light. The people of Rome now had to walk in the literal shadow of their sovereign's massive bronze ego. Inside the palace walls, the decoration was so opulent that it seemed to defy the limits of human wealth. Every single surface was covered in thin sheets of real gold, which gave the interior a soft, eternal glow even in the middle of the night. Rare jewels like emeralds and rubies were inset into the marble walls to look like drifting fallen stars. The ceilings of the dining rooms were made of fine-carved ivory panels that could secretly slide open like the wings of a bird. As the guests enjoyed their expensive meals, slaves above would drop showers of fresh rose petals and mist-scented perfumes down upon them. It was a carefully engineered fantasy world, where the harsh realities of life never dared to enter. Nero's favorite room was a magnificent circular dining hall, designed to rotate slowly day and night, mimicking the movement of the heavens above. The entire floor turned on a massive set of hidden bronze gears and water-powered mechanisms. Sitting at his table, the emperor could watch the view of his gilded empire slowly shift from one great window to the very next. Have you ever wondered if creating a perfect environment for yourself actually brings you the peace you crave, or if it merely isolates you further from the truth? When the construction was finally finished, Nero walked through the endless golden corridors and famously remarked that he was finally beginning to live like a real human being. His definition of humanity was very different from the rest. However, building this impossible dream required a tremendous amount of wealth that the burnt and broken empire simply did not possess anymore. To pay the massive construction bills, Nero was forced to devalue the Roman currency, reducing the amount of silver in each coin. He effectively robbed every single citizen to pay for the gold leaf on his private bedroom ceiling. The emperor also sent out merciless tax collectors to the distant provinces, demanding every spare coin from farmers and merchants who had never even seen the capital. He ordered the ancient temples of Greece to be stripped of their sacred statues and golden offerings. The gods themselves were being looted to decorate the private garden of a man who thought he was one. This relentless greed created a deep and dangerous resentment that began to simmer in every corner of the known world. The Roman aristocracy watched in horrified silence as their ancestral lands were seized to make room for Nero's artificial forest full of exotic animals. They realized that the emperor had abandoned the public good to build a private world where only he existed. While the people starved in the streets and the economy teetered on the edge of total collapse, Nero spent his days walking through his gilded groves. He would stop to recite poetry to the deer or sit by his man-made ocean, dreaming of more songs. He had successfully created a beautiful illusion of order, while the real world outside was slowly falling apart. The Golden House was a masterpiece of engineering and a disaster of political judgment. It stood as a constant physical reminder to every Roman citizen that their leader cared more about the aesthetics of his environment than the survival of his people. Every shimmering jewel on the wall represented 1,000 angry hearts beating in secret against the madness of the crown. Do you think a person can ever truly feel at home when their walls are built from the despair and theft of an entire nation? Nero believed his palace would make him immortal, protecting him from the vengeful ghosts of his past within a fortress of beauty. But a house built on stolen gold is rarely a place where one can find any sincere or lasting sleep. The construction never truly ended, as Nero constantly found new ways to spend money he did not have, on projects he did not need. He was obsessed with the idea of total control over his surroundings, trying to bend the earth itself to suit his whims. He turned the heart of Rome into a private theme park dedicated entirely to his own reflection. The architects Severus and Celer were praised as visionaries, but they were also the enablers of a king who had lost his connection to reality. They built him a revolving world, so he never had to look at the same static horizon twice. They helped him hide from the truth behind a curtain of gold and a shower of expensive scented petals. As the years passed, the Golden House became a symbol of everything that was wrong with the empire. It was too big, too bright, and too expensive for a world that was struggling to rebuild from the ashes of the Great Fire. The glittering walls did not radiate power, but rather a deep and very desperate sense of profound human loneliness. Nero would eventually find that no amount of gold can muffle the sound of a rising rebellion or hide the scent of approaching ruin. He had replaced the Republic with a stage, and the stage with a palace, until he had nowhere left to run except further into his own dreams. The Golden House was his greatest achievement, and it would soon become his beautiful gilded tomb. We often build massive monuments to our own success when we are most afraid of being forgotten, never realizing that the most lasting legacies are not built with stone and gold, but with the simple trust of those we are supposed to lead. Nero had all the gold in the world, but he no longer had a single person who sincerely believed in him. The sun set over the man-made lake, casting long shadows from the bronze colossus across the quiet water. Inside the rotating dining room, the emperor drank his wine and listened to the soft clicking of the gears. He felt safe within his golden shell, entirely unaware that the real world was already preparing to smash the glass from the outside with great violence. True luxury is often the most effective blindfold, hiding the approaching storm behind a shimmering curtain of our own magnificent desires. Chapter 12. Scapegoats in the Garden. The emperor realized that to save his own reputation, he needed to direct the tremendous anger of the homeless masses toward a small and misunderstood group of foreign outsiders who lived quietly in the shadows of the burnt city. The smoke over Rome had barely settled into a lingering gray haze when the dangerous whispers began to form a unified voice against the palace. People stood in long lines for free grain, clutching their few remaining earthly possessions, and openly wondered why their sovereign had been so quick to draw new blueprints while their old ancestral homes were still smoldering bitterly in the heat. Nero sensed the shifting winds of public opinion with the sharp intuition of a seasoned performer who knows when an audience is about to turn hostile. He knew that a massive national tragedy required a definitive villain, someone other than the man who dreamed of golden houses. He needed a target that was vulnerable, strange, and already viewed with deep suspicion by the ordinary Roman. In the darkened corners of the Transtiberum district, a new and mysterious cult from the far eastern provinces had been quietly growing like a hidden vine. These people called themselves Christians, and they followed the teachings of a crucified prophet who spoke of a kingdom not of this world. To the traditional Roman mind, their secretive ways felt deeply unsettling and entirely alien. The Christians were easy to isolate because they refused to participate in the vibrant public festivals or offer sacrifices to the ancient gods who protected the empire. They met in private homes at night, whispering about symbolic blood and hidden truths. This secrecy provided the perfect fertile soil for the emperor's propaganda machine to plant the poisonous seeds of a very deadly lie. Nero's advisors carefully crafted a narrative that blamed these religious outsiders for setting the Great Fire as an act of calculated hatred against the human race. They claimed the Christians desired to see the world end in flames to usher in their own heavenly kingdom. It was a brilliant and cruel bit of political theater that transformed victims into terrorists within a single news cycle. However, for Nero, simply ordering a series of boring executions was not sufficient for the grand artistic vision he now maintained for every aspect of his life. He believed that public punishment should be a highly engaging spectacle, a form of dark entertainment that would distract the people from their own hunger and grief. He decided to host an elaborate series of evening garden parties. The chosen venue was the emperor's private gardens located near the Vatican Hill, a place usually reserved for the inner circle of the wealthy imperial court. The grounds were exceptionally beautiful, filled with exotic flowering trees, smooth marble statues, and shimmering fountains that tinkled softly in the night air. It was a setting designed for romance and philosophical reflection, not for brutal state terror. Nero approached the organization of these events with a chilling and cold bureaucratic efficiency that revealed the darker side of his artistic nature. He personally inspected the selection of the costumes and the placement of the props, ensuring that every single detail contributed to the overall aesthetic effect. He wanted to prove that even death could be transformed into a masterpiece of stage design. As the sun set over the 7 hills, the wealthy citizens of Rome were invited to stroll through the gilded groves under the soft light of the rising moon. The air was filled with the sweet scent of blooming jasmine and the delicate sound of lyre music drifting through the trees. It felt like a dream of paradise, until one looked closer at the tall wooden stakes. The emperor had ordered hundreds of Christians to be wrapped in heavy layers of animal skins and coated thickly in flammable tar and resin. They were then tied securely to tall poles planted along the wide gravel paths. These human beings were not treated as criminals to be punished, but as literal lamps designed to provide a golden glow for the evening socializing. When the first torch was applied to the base of these stakes, the garden was suddenly bathed in a brilliant and terrifying orange light. The screams of the dying were drowned out by the loud laughter of the guests and the persistent rhythms of the imperial orchestra. Nero had successfully turned a religious persecution into a very chic and fashionable high society garden party. Have you ever wondered how thin the veneer of civilization truly is when a man can sip fine wine while his neighbors burn to provide light for his path? The contrast between the refined manners of the guests and the raw horror of the execution was a masterclass in moral dissonance. The emperor had created a world where aesthetics had completely replaced every single ancient concept of justice. Nero himself joined the festivities not as a stern judge, but as a playful charioteer. He dressed in a simple green tunic, driving his light golden chariot skillfully between the burning torches, waving happily at the crowd and cracking his whip with joyous enthusiasm. He felt like a living legend, a master of life and death who could manipulate the elements to suit his whims. This was the moment when Nero's performative art transitioned from being merely absurd into being truly monstrous. He no longer sought to reflect the human condition through his music. He sought to dominate it through violence. The entire empire was now his stage, and he was both the leading actor and the only director whose opinion truly mattered in the final analysis. The guests at these parties initially cheered for the spectacle, glad to have someone to blame for their own misfortunes. But as the weeks dragged on, a strange and heavy silence began to settle over the Roman people. Even the most jaded citizens found the emperor's excessive cruelty to be deeply distasteful and uncomfortably personal. They began to feel a growing sympathy for the victims. People noticed that the Christians met their deaths with a quiet and dignified courage that the emperor himself completely lacked. They did not beg for mercy or curse their executioners. They prayed softly until the flames finally stilled their voices. This unexpected strength of character made the public realize that these people were not dangerous monsters, but mere scapegoats sacrificed for one man's massive ego. The great garden parties successfully distracted the mob for a short while, but they also permanently stained Nero's reputation in a way that no amount of golden houses could ever fix. He had revealed himself to be a man who found beauty in suffering, a quality that even the bloodthirsty Romans found impossible to truly respect or admire in their divine sovereign ruler. History often remembers these moments, not for the political goals they achieved, but for the chilling lack of simple human empathy they displayed. Nero thought he was lighting up the night, but he was actually casting a very long and permanent shadow over his own future. He was learning that you can burn a person, but you cannot successfully burn away the truth of your own actions. While the embers of the human torches smoldered into blackened cinders, the emperor retreated to his palace, feeling fully vindicated by the success of his performance. He believed he had solved the problem of the fire and the problem of the people in one brilliant theatrical move. He went to sleep dreaming of new songs, entirely unaware that he had just planted the seeds of rebellion. The fragrant flowers of the garden continued to bloom. In the morning sun, their roots drinking from soil that had witnessed the absolute worst of human nature. The world looked exactly the same as it had before, yet everything had fundamentally changed. The people of Rome now knew exactly what kind of man sat upon their throne, and they would never forget the smell of that summer smoke. We often find that the most dangerous lies are not the ones we tell to others, but the ones we tell to ourselves to justify the horrible things we do, in the pursuit of our own safety and vain personal glory. Nero had bought himself a little time, but the cost was the final shred of his own humanity, leaving him entirely alone in his glittering and dark empire. Sometimes the brightest lights we create only serve to reveal the deep and terrifying emptiness that we are trying so desperately to hide from the rest of the watching world. Chapter 13. The Olympic Champion of Everything. Nero decided to leave the restless city of Rome behind to embark on a grand and highly orchestrated musical tour of ancient Greece, where he intended to compete in every single major athletic and artistic competition to prove once and for all that he was the greatest talent in human history. In the year 66 of the Common Era, the emperor felt a growing disconnect from the stiff and disapproving aristocracy of the capital. He longed for the cultured embrace of the Greeks, whom he believed were the only people capable of truly appreciating the delicate nuances of his voice and the subtle grace of his chariot racing skills in the sun. He arrived in Greece not as a conqueror with heavy iron swords, but as a humble artist carrying only a lyre and a massive entourage of paid clappers. The Greek city-states, well aware of his tremendous power and his even larger ego, decided to postpone their traditional sacred calendars just to accommodate the whims of this singular royal visitor. The famous Olympic Games, usually held only every 4 years without exception, were suddenly rescheduled to align perfectly with Nero's travel itinerary. New categories for music and heraldry were hastily created, so the emperor could compete in events where he actually had some measure of competence, though the outcome was already guaranteed by the presence of his soldiers. The most anticipated event was the Great Chariot race held in the dusty stadium of Olympia. While other drivers used the standard 4 horses, Nero insisted on driving a magnificent golden chariot pulled by 10 high-spirited stallions. It was a monstrous and unwieldy machine that no other human being on Earth would have ever dared to handle alone. As the race began, the sheer weight of the massive 10-horse team proved to be completely unmanageable for the emperor's relatively inexperienced hands. During a sharp turn at the far end of the track, Nero was violently thrown from his seat, tumbling into the choking dust while his horses continued to gallop wildly away without him toward the finish line. The entire stadium fell into a stunned and terrified silence as the supreme master of the world lay motionless in the dirt. His attendants rushed forward to help him stand, dusting off his expensive tunics, while the other drivers deliberately slowed their own teams to a crawl, afraid to cross the finish line before the fallen sovereign could rejoin the meaningless competition. Despite never actually crossing the finish line or even finishing the required number of laps, Nero was solemnly declared the winner by the trembling judges. They awarded him the sacred olive wreath of victory, while the paid clappers in the stands roared their approval, creating a bizarre scene where the truth was publicly murdered in favor of a very convenient royal fantasy. Nero accepted the prize with a modest smile, entirely convincing himself that his skill alone had secured the win. He believed that the fates themselves had intervened to ensure justice for a divine artist who had simply encountered a bit of unlucky bad weather on the track. he never once questioned the authenticity of the gold medals he collected daily. This pattern continued throughout his entire tour of the Greek peninsula. He participated in every singing contest, every acting competition, and every public poetry reading available in every small town. By the time he was ready to leave, the emperor had amassed more than 1,800 individual victory crowns, making him the most decorated competitor in ancient world history. To repay the Greeks for their wonderful honesty and generosity, Nero granted the entire province freedom from paying any further taxes to the Roman government. It was an incredibly expensive gesture that further bankrupted the already strained imperial treasury. But to Nero, no price was too high to pay for the feeling of being truly understood by a truly civilized audience. Even in this controlled environment, Nero suffered from immense pre-performance anxiety. He would often tremble in the wings of the theater, clinging to his lyre as if it were a life raft in a stormy sea. He desperately craved valid evidence that he was special, even if he had to orchestrate the entire context of that evidence himself. Have you ever noticed how some people will willingly believe a beautiful lie rather than face a very ugly and boring truth about their own limitations? Nero lived in a mirrored hall of his own creation, where every single surface reflected back the image of a genius. He had successfully deleted the very concept of failure from his personal vocabulary entirely. The judges who awarded him these prizes were not fools. They were simply men who valued their own lives more than the abstract integrity of the Olympic Games. They understood that the truth is a very dangerous thing to maintain when facing a man who commands legions. They exchanged their ancient honor for a few more years of living in relative safety. When Nero finally returned to Rome, he did not enter like a conquering hero from a war. He entered through a specially cut gap in the city walls, carrying his thousands of wreaths on magnificent silk cushions. He wanted the citizens to see that he had conquered not through blood, but through the higher power of music and theatrical athleticism. The Roman people watched this strange parade with a mixture of boredom and growing contempt. While the emperor was chasing wreaths in Greece, the practical problems of the empire were only getting worse. Prices for grain were skyrocketing. Soldiers were becoming increasingly restless on the borders, and the people were tired of paying for a ruler who was never home to lead them. Nero was now living completely inside his own dream, surrounded by thousands of symbols of victory that actually meant absolutely nothing. He had won everything, and yet he had actually achieved nothing of substance. The reality of his failing reign was waiting for him in the shadows of the palace, but he was too busy admiring his olive wreaths to notice anything else. There is a deep sadness in a victory that requires no effort other than the mere act of existing. Nero had stripped the games of their meaning and the throne of its weight, leaving behind only a hollow spectacle that could not withstand the sharp reality of a real rebellion. He was a champion of a world that no longer existed outside his mind. The Greek sun set over the empty stadiums, leaving behind the echoes of cheering that had been purchased with gold and fear. The emperor believed he had finally proven his worth to the world, but he had only proven how quickly we will abandon our most sacred values when we are afraid of the person holding the bright golden scepter. The most bitter truth we often hide from ourselves is that a crown received through fear can never replace the deep and honest warmth of a single sincere applause, earned through true personal merit. Chapter 14. Letters of Rebellion. the distant sound of marching feet and the scratching of rebellious pens. The provinces finally reached the golden walls of the palace, yet the emperor remained deeply preoccupied with the intricate mechanical pipes of a new musical invention. While Nero had been collecting thousands of sacred crowns, in Greece the practical foundations of his imperial authority had slowly begun to rot beneath the heavy weight of constant neglect. The soldiers standing guard on the cold and foggy frontiers of the empire felt entirely forgotten by a leader who seemed to care more about chariot races than their daily survival. In the distant province of Gaul, a high-ranking governor named Gaius Julius Vindex finally decided that he could no longer endure the absurd whims of a man who viewed the world as a stage. He wrote secret letters to other powerful men, suggesting that the time had finally come to replace the singing king with someone who actually understood the sword. Vindex did not simply accuse Nero of being a brutal tyrant or a poor administrator, which were charges the emperor might have easily ignored without concern. Instead, he boldly wrote that Nero was actually a very mediocre musician and a truly terrible lyra player. This sharp personal insult pierced through the imperial pride far more effectively than any military threat ever could. When these insulting letters were finally delivered to the palace, Nero did not call for his generals or inspect his maps of the Western territories. He simply gathered his friends and expressed his deep outrage that anyone could be so blind to his incredible artistic talents. He asked them if they had ever heard a better singer, seeking comfort in their false praise. Instead of addressing the rising military danger, Nero spent several quiet days working closely with an engineer on a newly invented musical device known as a water organ. This complex machine used the constant pressure of water to force air through a row of bronze pipes, creating a powerful and haunting sound that could be heard throughout the entire palace gardens in the late afternoon. The emperor was so delighted by this scientific wonder that he summoned the remaining members of the Senate to a private demonstration. They arrived expecting an urgent discussion regarding the civil war in Gaul, only to find their sovereign enthusiastically explaining the mechanics of the air valves and the tuning of the individual bronze pipes, while the empire slowly burned down around them. While Nero was tinkering with his musical invention, a much more serious threat emerged from the province of Spain. Servius Sulpicius Galba, a respected and stern old general who represented the traditional values of Rome, was officially proclaimed emperor by his loyal legions. The rebellion was no longer a distant protest, but a fully organized march toward the heart of the capital city itself. Nero's response to this imminent danger was not to fight, but to design a new kind of theatrical performance that he believed would solve the problem. He seriously proposed that he should walk out alone to meet the rebellious armies without any protection. He imagined that he would simply cry in front of the soldiers and sing a song of deep, mournful regret until they wept. He genuinely believed that the power of his artistic expression would be sufficient to overcome the cold steel of the legions. He spent his evenings rehearsing the exact way he would fall, to his knees, and the specific emotional pitch of his voice. In his mind, even a violent coup was just another opportunity to earn a heartfelt, standing ovation from a surprised audience. However, reality began to intrude upon his fantasy world when the Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers tasked with protecting the emperor's own life, finally realized that their leader had completely lost his sanity. They were offered enormous bribes by the supporters of Galba, and for the first time in decades, The guards remained, silent and still, instead of chanting for their master. The great halls of the Golden House, which had once been filled with the sound of constant music and the laughter of thousands of guests, suddenly became eerily quiet and very empty. The wealthy courtiers who had spent years flattering Nero's ego began to slip away into the night, taking with them the expensive silk curtains, the silver goblets, and every other valuable possession. Nero found himself wandering through the darkened palace with only a few loyal servants and a small handful of freedmen who had nowhere else to go. He looked for someone to offer him advice, but all he found was the echo of his own voice bouncing off the gilded walls. The massive statue of himself in the entryway seemed to stare at him coldly. Even in these final hours of power, the emperor could not resist the urge to return to his water organ one last time. He sat down and played a few melancholy notes, watching the water flow through the transparent tubes. He remarked that if he could just perfect the tuning of the smallest pipe, he might finally be content to die as a great artist. News finally arrived that the Roman Senate, which had spent years trembling at his feet, had officially declared Nero a public enemy of the state. This meant that anyone could kill him without any legal consequences, and he was sentenced to be beaten to death by rods in the ancient traditional manner. The curtain was finally falling on the play he had directed. Realizing that his time had finally run out, Nero disguised himself in a simple tattered tunic and mounted a tired horse. He fled the city under the cover of a terrible thunderstorm, heading toward a small villa owned by one of his remaining loyal freedmen. The ground beneath him shook with the sound of thunder, which he mistook for an approaching and angry army. As he rode through the dark, he must have thought about all the crowns he had won in Greece and all the flowers that had fallen from his revolving ceiling. He had spent his life trying to force the world to love him, never realizing that true authority is built on something far more substantial than the fleeting approval of a paid crowd of guests. The water organ remained behind in the silent palace, its pipes slowly running dry as the pressure finally dropped. It was a masterpiece of engineering, designed to create beautiful sounds. But like Nero's entire reign, it was ultimately a fragile and expensive toy that could not survive once. The supply of real power was suddenly cut off by the unforgiving truths of life. The rebellion had succeeded, not because of brilliant military strategy, but because the people had finally become bored with the performance. They wanted a ruler who would provide them with order and bread, not one who would demand that they weep for his character's tragic fate. The stage was being cleared for a new act, and the old actor was now alone. We often find that the most intricate machines we build to distract ourselves from reality are the very first things to fail when the cold winds of truth finally begin to blow through our lives. Chapter 15. What an Artist Dies with Me. The final hours of the last Julio Claudian emperor unfolded in a dusty suburban villa where a man who once owned the known world found himself looking for a tiny patch of earth grand enough for his final resting place. The gray light of a rainy dawn filtered through the heavy overhanging clouds as Nero reached the modest suburban estate of his loyal freedman Phaon, located just 4 miles outside the great city walls. The emperor was no longer dressed in shimmering purple silk but wore a simple tattered tunic and a dark faded cloak to hide his famous face from any passing soldiers. The journey had been one of total terror and deep physical exhaustion for a man who had only known the softest Egyptian linens and the constant service of thousands. He had been forced to leap over deep muddy ditches and drink lukewarm, stagnant water from his bare hands just to survive the night. The glittering illusion of his divine status had completely evaporated in the rain. To enter the villa without being seen by possible spies, Nero was forced to crawl on his hands and knees through a small, narrow hole cut into the outer stone wall. Inside, the house was cold, dark, and smelled deeply of neglect and old dust. It was a bitter contrast to the rotating dining rooms and scented rose petals of his recent Golden Palace life. Even in this desperate state of absolute ruin, Nero's tremendous ego remained completely intact and entirely shielded from the harsh truth of his situation. He walked into the small, overgrown garden and carefully inspected the dark soil with the eyes of a discerning architect. He bitterly complained to his remaining servants that this dirty patch of ground was far too common for him. He felt that a man of his incredible artistic stature deserved a monument made of the finest white marble, inscribed with beautiful Greek poetry, not a shallow hole dug in the weeds. He refused to accept that his final audience would be nothing more than a few stunned beetles and the quiet rustling of the dead summer leaves under the gray morning sky. A final messenger soon arrived carrying the official report from the Roman Senate declaring that Nero was now a public enemy to be executed in the ancient manner. When he asked what this specific punishment entailed, his servant softly explained that he would be stripped naked, locked in a wooden fork, and beaten with heavy iron rods until his very final breath. The prospect of such a crude and brutal death finally shattered the emperor's remaining thin resolve and plunged him into a state of utterly silent panic. He picked up 2 sharp imperial daggers, testing the edges with his fingers, but then quickly set them back down upon the wooden table. He simply could not bring himself to perform the very last act. He begged one of his loyal friends to kill themselves first, to show him how to do it bravely, but no one in the small dark room stepped forward. He was a man who had ordered the deaths of thousands without a single second of hesitation. Yet he found the cold steel of his own, simple weapon to be completely impossible to properly face alone. As the distant sound of galloping horses finally began to echo against the villa walls, Nero realized that the Roman cavalry had finally discovered his secret hiding place. The final curtain was truly about to fall upon his chaotic life. He uttered his most famous final words to the empty air. "What an artist dies along within me today, in this lonely place." It was a statement of profound self-delusion, believing that the world was losing a great creative genius rather than just a frightened and very violent tyrant. With the help of his devoted secretary Epaphroditus, he finally drove the sharp dagger into his own throat just as the heavy wooden doors were smashed open by the reaching hands of the approaching Roman soldiers. A centurion rushed into the small dark room and tried to stop the bleeding with his own rough cloak, claiming he had come to save the emperor's life. Nero looked up at him with fading pale eyes and whispered a final sarcastic remark about the man's late loyalty. He then fell back against the cold stone floor, his body finally becoming still. The death of Nero marked the sudden and total end of the great Julio-Claudian dynasty, a family line that had produced both the greatest heroes and the most terrifying monsters of the ancient world. The Roman people initially celebrated in the streets, wearing caps of freedom and tossing flowers, relieved that the long and exhausting theatrical performance of his reign was finally over. However, the stability that the old dynasty had provided for nearly 100 years was now completely gone, leaving a massive power vacuum that would soon plunge the empire into a brutal and bloody civil war. The people quickly realized that a mad singer was perhaps better than 4 different generals, all fighting for the same gilded throne at the very same time. History has remained deeply fascinated by this man who set the world on fire, not because he was evil in a traditional way, but because he was deeply insecure. He was a vulnerable child who was handed too much power, a minor artist who was handed an entire civilization as his personal stage, and a human being who completely lost his sense of true self. We often look back at the chaos of Nero's life and see a monster, but perhaps it is more helpful to see him as a mirror reflecting our own desire for validation. We all want to be applauded. We all want to be special, and we all sometimes build golden houses to hide from the quiet truths that we are too afraid to face in the dark. The greatest tragedy of Nero was not the fire he watched or the people he harmed, but the fact that he never actually realized who he was without the purple robes. He lived his entire life as a performance, and when the audience finally stopped clapping and left the theater, he found that he had absolutely nothing of substance left to hold onto alone. As you drift into a deep and peaceful sleep tonight, remember that true worth is not found in the magnitude of our achievements or the volume of the applause we receive. It is found in the quiet integrity of our actions and the simple kindness we show to those who share our small corner of the vast and complicated world we all inhabit. Thank you for joining me on this long journey through the smoky streets of ancient Rome and the gilded corridors of the Golden House. If you enjoyed this quiet exploration of human nature and history, please remember to like this story and subscribe to the channel for more immersive tales from the deep past. Your support helps these stories continue to reach new ears. If you were handed absolute power over the entire world tomorrow, would you have the courage to be yourself? Or would you gradually turn into a performer for an audience you secretly fear?